I didn't even notice her leave. 1 second, she was standing there, half leaning against the counter with that quiet confidence she carries like it's second nature, and the next she was gone, slipping into the kitchen. I stayed frozen, fumbling with the strap of my bag like a fool, not because I was scared, but because I wasn't sure what to do with all the attention, or maybe the tension, that had settled over me. Her cousin, who just walked in, leaned casually against the doorway and gave me that sly, assessing smile. "You look different tonight," he said. Not exactly a question, more like a statement that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I wanted to laugh, to brush it off, but the words clung to me, hovering in the air, reminding me that I was somehow out of place, yet noticed. The repair shop smelled faintly of motor oil and coffee, a combination that usually made me gag, but tonight it felt oddly intimate. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off the steel counters and glass display cases, but she made the room feel softer somehow, like the edges weren't quite so sharp. She moved back into view, carrying a tray of cups, her expression calm and measured, but her eyes flicked toward me in that way that made me forget how to breathe. "Here," she said, handing me a mug. My fingers brushed hers, just briefly, but long enough for the quiet thrum in my chest to spike. I kept my eyes on her, trying not to betray the way I noticed every little movement, the slight tilt of her head, the subtle arch of her brow, the way she lingered near the counter even though there was no reason to. We didn't speak for a moment. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words got stuck somewhere behind my teeth. Instead, we shared that awkward pause, that fragile, unspoken acknowledgement that something was happening here, even if neither of us wanted to name it. Her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile, and I realized she'd caught me staring. I quickly looked away, embarrassed, but the memory of it burned behind my eyes. She laughed softly at something her cousin said, a low, warm sound that made my chest tighten. I watched the way her fingers wrapped around the cup, how she balanced her weight lightly on one foot, and I couldn't stop thinking about how natural she was, how she carried herself like she had no reason to care whether anyone noticed her. Except, maybe, that one person who always did. I wanted to ask her something trivial, just to keep the moment alive, but my throat was dry. Instead, I took a slow sip of coffee, pretending it mattered, while she moved past me, her perfume lingering in the air like a promise I couldn't name. The room felt smaller now, as if her presence had pulled everything closer, and I realized I'd been holding my breath without even noticing. By the time she disappeared into the back again, I was left with the faint warmth of the mug in my hands and a strange, unshakable awareness that nothing in the room would ever feel quite ordinary again. And yet, the thing I couldn't stop thinking about, the thing that made my chest ache just a little, was the way she had looked at me when she handed me the cup, that brief, lingering glance that seemed to say everything without saying a word. It was mid-afternoon when I found myself leaning over the counter beside her, trying to figure out why the new display shelf wouldn't fit the way the instructions promised it would. She stood across from me, arms crossed, watching with that calm, controlled gaze that made it impossible to know what she was really thinking. "I think you're twisting it the wrong way," she said softly, almost too casually, but her voice carried a subtle edge. I looked up and caught the faintest furrow in her brow. Quick, almost imperceptible, but it made my stomach tighten. She was always so precise, so careful, and yet I could see, in that tiny crease, that she wasn't entirely sure either. Her hands moved to the shelf, fingers brushing the surface lightly, and I noticed the small scars along her knuckles. Not deep ones, just faint reminders of years of work, of life. I wanted to reach out, to touch her hand, but I caught myself. Instead, I mimicked her movement, careful not to bump into her. She glanced at me then, briefly, and there was a hesitation in her eyes, as if she'd considered saying something more but thought better of it. We worked in near silence after that, the hum of the overhead lights and the quiet scrape of tools filling the space between us. I noticed the way her hair caught the light when she leaned forward, how her shoulders slumped slightly whenever she realized she'd miscalculated something. There was a softness there I hadn't seen before, a vulnerability she didn't offer easily. Sorry, she murmured after a particularly stubborn shelf piece refused to fit. Her voice was barely audible, but it made me stop in my tracks. Not because of the apology itself, but because of the quiet weariness behind it. I wanted to say it wasn't a big deal, but words felt clumsy here. Instead, I offered a small, encouraging nod. She looked at me then, and I thought I saw a flicker of something, gratitude, maybe, or a silent acknowledgement that I was paying attention. I caught myself stealing glances at her, noticing the subtle details. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the delicate movement of her hands as she adjusted the shelf, the tired curve under her eyes that only made her seem more real, more fragile. I felt a gentle pull in my chest, the kind that makes you aware of every small gesture, every pause, every breath. She laughed suddenly, a light, unguarded sound at a minor slip I made with the instructions. My heart jumped. It wasn't the first time she'd laughed, but this time it lingered in the room differently. Something in that laugh softened her edge, revealed the person behind the composed exterior. And I realized I wanted to be there for that person, not just the confident, precise version she always showed. When the shelf finally clicked into place, we stood side by side, both silent, both slightly out of breath from effort and awkwardness. Our shoulders brushed briefly, and I could feel the warmth of her against me. She didn't pull away, didn't acknowledge it either, just moved on to straighten the remaining items. But I couldn't shake the tension that had settled between us, subtle and charged, like the air before a storm. I wanted to linger, to see if she'd noticed the tiny tremor in my fingers, the way my heart raced when our eyes met for the briefest second. Instead, I just watched her, committing the quiet scene to memory, because even in her silence, she had left an imprint I wouldn't be able to forget. The office was nearly empty that evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the old building the only sounds besides the rain tapping against the windows. She had stayed late, of course, always precise with deadlines, and somehow, I had ended up lingering too, claiming I needed to check a few things but really just wanting to be near her. We sat across from each other at the small conference table, papers scattered around like a storm of responsibility, but my attention wasn't on the work. It was on the way her fingers absently traced the edge of a pen, the way her eyes darted to the rain outside before settling back on me with that calm, unreadable expression. I didn't expect anyone to be here this late, she said quietly. Not a question, just a statement that hung in the space between us. I could hear the faint tremor in her voice, though she masked it almost immediately with a shrug. I wanted to finish a few things, I said, but the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I wanted to say more, to tell her I hadn't left because I wanted to be near her, because every glance she gave me sent something electric through my chest. But restraint won this round. I just nodded, forcing my focus back to the papers. A flash of lightning lit the room briefly, and for a split second, our hands brushed over the table. Neither of us moved away immediately. The contact was fleeting, subtle, but it sent a small shock up my arm that made my breath hitch. I felt the pull, something forbidden, something alive, and yet the rational part of my mind screamed that I couldn't act on it. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down, eyes narrowing slightly at the screen. "It's nothing," she muttered quickly, though the tone carried an edge of annoyance. Or was it worry? I didn't press. Whatever it was, it created a wall between us instantly. The moment dissipated like smoke in the rainstorm outside, leaving a heavier silence behind. I watched her adjust her chair, smoothing the edge of her blazer over her shoulder, and noticed the exhaustion lining her eyes, the faint tension in her jaw. It made me ache quietly inside, not with desire alone, but with the realization of how fragile these moments were, how easily they could slip away. We returned to work, the room too quiet, the storm outside louder than it needed to be. Every now and then, our eyes met across the table, lingering just a fraction too long before one of us looked away. I could feel the pull between us, like a tide rising silently, dangerous in its subtlety. A sudden clap of thunder made her flinch slightly, and instinctively, I reached a hand forward. Not fully, just close enough that she might feel it if she leaned slightly. She didn't move, didn't pull away, and for a heartbeat, the space between us vanished. My heart pounded, and I wanted to lean in, to close the gap entirely, to see if she'd let me. But the sound of her phone vibrating again brought me back. I froze. I stayed still, my hand hovering near hers, neither retreating nor closing the distance. I didn't move, because I couldn't risk the consequences, but I also didn't let go, because I couldn't risk losing the electricity between us either. And just like that, the storm outside and the buzzing phone stole the moment, leaving me staring at her fingers, almost touching, almost ours. The rain had stopped, but the world outside the window still glistened with wet asphalt and reflected streetlights. We stood near the edge of the shop, the remnants of the day scattered around us. Tools, papers, a half-empty coffee cup that I hadn't touched. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the room, as if the street outside held all the answers. I wanted to break the silence, to say something clever, or at least distracting, but the words lodged in my throat. The tension between us was too thick for small talk, too quiet for jokes. Finally, she sighed, a long, deliberate sound that seemed to draw all the air from the room. "What are we doing?" Her voice was low, almost hesitant, but every syllable carried a weight that made me flinch. Not a question about the shelf, not about the work, but about us. Or maybe about the way I'd been staring at her all afternoon, the way she'd been watching me in return. I swallowed, trying to keep my own voice steady. I don't know," I admitted, though it sounded paltry, childish even. But it was the truth. I couldn't define what was happening here, couldn't even rationalize why every glance from her made my chest tighten. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw it. The guarded edge, the flicker of fear behind her composed exterior, the way she measured every word she said. "Because this, us, it's not normal," she said softly. "And I think we've been pretending it is." Her words hit me like a punch I'd been bracing for, the slow kind that drains you of breath before you can react. I wanted to reach for her, to say it was fine, that I didn't care about normal, but the hesitation stopped me. Instead, I just watched, taking in the subtle movements. The way she let her shoulders slump slightly, the faint tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes searched mine for something she wasn't ready to name. "I can't," I started, but the words dissolved. What could I say that wouldn't make it worse? What could I say that wouldn't betray the way my thoughts had been circling her like moths to a flame? She leaned back slightly, pressing the edge of the counter into her hands, and I noticed how fragile she looked, how human and tired. And yet, even in that vulnerability, there was a kind of quiet strength, a resilience I couldn't stop noticing. We stood there, a long silence stretching between us, punctuated only by the distant hum of the street and the faint drip of water from the roof. No one moved, no one spoke, and the space between us became a language all its own, charged, unspoken, unbearably honest. Then she finally said it, barely above a whisper, the kind of thing you shouldn't hear but can't turn away from. "I don't think I can pretend anymore. Not with you. Not like this." Her eyes didn't look away. She didn't ask me to answer. She didn't need me to. The weight of her words hung in the air, devastating in its clarity, and I realized that everything had changed. Everything had shifted, and the quiet truth between us was louder than any touch could ever be. I was shelving boxes in the corner when she appeared behind me, carrying a small stack of old invoices and manuals. Her fingers brushed against mine as she passed them over, and I froze, not out of surprise, but because there was a softness in her eyes I hadn't seen before. I need to tell you something," she said, voice low, hesitant, like she was testing the words in her mouth before letting them escape. I stopped what I was doing, turning fully toward her. The room felt smaller suddenly, charged with an invisible weight I couldn't name. "I didn't always handle things well," she continued, glancing down at the papers she clutched like a shield. "There was someone long ago, someone I thought I'd never get over. And I made mistakes, big ones. Things I can't undo." Her eyes flicked up, meeting mine for a second before darting away. I noticed the faint tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders tightened as if bracing against some invisible pressure. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She wasn't even asking for understanding. She was just admitting, quietly, to herself and to me, that she had carried this weight alone for years. I didn't know what to say. My chest ached with the urge to reach out, to tell her it was okay, that maybe we could unpack it together, but I stayed still, letting her words settle in the room like dust in a sunbeam. Instead, I remembered something I'd seen the other day, a photo tucked into one of her old manuals, faded and curling at the edges. A younger version of her, smiling with someone who wasn't me. The memory of it made my stomach knot, not with jealousy, but with the sudden clarity of how much she had carried silently and how much I was now stepping into. I didn't know, I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was speaking to her or just letting the realization escape my own chest. She gave a small, almost apologetic smile. No one did. Not even me, really. Her voice cracked slightly, and I noticed for the first time the fatigue hidden behind her composure, the faint shadows under her eyes that spoke of late nights, regrets, and unanswered questions. I wanted to say more, but the room felt too fragile for words. Instead, I let the silence hold us together, the only sound the soft scrape of the papers shifting in her hands. Every heartbeat between us seemed louder than any confession, louder than the past or the mistakes or the weight of memory. Then she did something I didn't expect. She placed one of the papers on the counter. Not a note, not a letter, just a single, faded receipt from years ago. "I found this last week," she said softly. It reminded me of him. And I guess it reminded me how much I let myself get lost. I reached for the paper, careful not to touch her hand, though I wanted to. My fingers brushed the edge, and in that instant, the room seemed to shrink, charged with an unspoken truth. We were both standing on the edge of something we hadn't dared name. She looked at me then, eyes searching, hesitant, vulnerable, and for a moment, everything else, the past, the mistakes, the rain outside, faded. I couldn't speak. I didn't move. I just stayed there, heart thudding, knowing the world had shifted silently, irreversibly, between us. And I realized, without words, that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The next morning, the shop was quiet in a way that felt different, lighter, somehow, as if the air itself had shifted overnight. She arrived first, as usual, and I came in a few minutes later, trying not to make it obvious that I had been thinking about her every moment since yesterday. We worked side by side in silence for a while, arranging shelves and sorting invoices, the rhythm between us easy but charged. There were no confessions, no declarations, just the tacit acknowledgement that something had changed, that the space between us could no longer be ignored or dismissed. I caught her glancing at me once, and she didn't look away immediately. The brief eye contact held a weight that no words could carry. I smiled, small, hesitant, and she returned it with the faintest tilt of her head, as if granting permission for something unspoken. She bent down to pick up a box, and I noticed the way her hair fell across her face. Without thinking, I reached out and tucked it behind her ear. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She just let me, and in that quiet allowance, the unspoken tension we'd been dancing around for weeks seemed to crystallize into something steady, inevitable. For the first time, we didn't need words to fill the silence. The shared space itself became the confession, the way our movements synchronized, the way we reached for the same item without speaking, the way the occasional brush of our hands sent a small, undeniable jolt through me. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't dramatic. It was real, earned, fragile, and entirely ours. At one point, she leaned against the counter, tired from the morning work, and I slid the chair closer so we could sit. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. Just sitting there, side by side, the quiet hum of the shop around us felt like a decision made silently and fully, to be present with each other, to hold the space, to let the connection breathe without forcing it. Her hand moved slightly, and I hesitated before brushing my fingers over hers, a gentle acknowledgement of what we both already knew. She didn't react outwardly, no dramatic gasp, no sudden move, but the small, deliberate contact said more than any declaration ever could. Minutes passed, maybe an hour, or maybe just a heartbeat stretched thin across the room. I caught her gaze once more, and she held it just long enough for me to understand. Whatever this was, whatever had been building between us, it didn't need a label or a vow. It simply existed, quietly, persistently, irrevocably. When she finally leaned back and exhaled, it wasn't relief or surrender. It was acceptance, the kind that comes from realizing some truths cannot be denied. I let my forehead brush briefly against hers, a faint, tender connection that sealed the quiet acknowledgement between us. No words, no promises, just the sense that what had begun in glances, in subtle touches, and in unspoken confessions had found its place. And for the first time, I felt like we could finally breathe together, without rushing, without fear, simply being present in a moment that was ours alone. The world outside continued on, indifferent, but inside that small, dimly lit shop, we had found something fragile, steady, and completely, quietly real. Looking back now, months later, I realize how quietly everything shifted between us. It wasn't fireworks or dramatic confessions. It was in the way our mornings began with shared coffee and unspoken understanding, in the small gestures that once would have felt electric but became ordinary in the most comforting way. She changed, too. I see it clearly when I remember her hesitations from the early days, how she guarded her laughter, how she measured every word. Now, there's a softness, a willingness to let someone in, without fear that the past would swallow her. She still carries the weight of her regrets, but she carries them with less tension, and somehow, that makes her glow differently. I've changed, too. I used to notice her with quiet obsession, weighing every glance, memorizing every gesture. Now, I still notice, but it's gentler. I can let her be herself without clinging, without wanting to control or fix anything. I've learned that love isn't about consuming someone else's attention. It's about holding space for them, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's complicated. The shop hasn't changed much. The same hum of fluorescent lights, the same cluttered counters, but I see it differently now. It holds the echoes of our first awkward moments, the laughter and near misses, the quiet confessions that never needed words. Even the rain outside doesn't feel like tension anymore. It feels like life moving steadily around us, allowing us to exist in the space we built together. What I didn't expect, and what I think is the most beautiful lesson, is how ordinary it all feels. Love didn't explode into perfection. It settled into the gaps between the moments, into the silences, into the small gestures that once might have seemed meaningless. And maybe that's the thing we don't always notice. The real intimacy, the lasting connection, lives in the quiet, in the pauses, in the spaces where words and actions overlap without trying to define themselves. I think about that first night, the glance over the counter, the slight brush of our hands, the unspoken pull between us. At the time, it felt dangerous, impossible, a storm waiting to break. Now, I see it as the beginning, not of a perfect story, but of a story that learned patience, that let itself grow in honesty, that let two people meet without rushing toward a label or a finale. And the wonder of it is that this is just how life moves forward, imperfect, slow, deliberate. She laughs easily now, sometimes glancing at me with a spark I recognize, but don't try to name. I smile back, quietly, because it's enough. Always enough. If I could leave the story in one image, it would be us sitting side by side at the counter, hands close but not quite touching, sharing the weight of the day and the quiet certainty that we belong here, together, in this small corner of the world. No grand gestures, no confessions, just presence. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?